September 1st, 1944. A dust track cut through the Normandy bocage carries a column of trucks stretching further than the eye can follow. Headlights taped to slits, engines grinding in low gear through the dark. In the cab of the lead vehicle, a young corporal from Alabama grips the wheel with both hands, watching the red-hooded taillight of the truck ahead as though his life depends on it, because it does. Behind him, nose to tail, bumper to bumper, roll thousands more, each one carrying 5 tons of fuel, ammunition, or rations toward an army that is outrunning its own supply lines faster than anyone in Washington had thought possible. This is not a tank column. There are no guns here, no armor, nothing to stop a strafing run but speed and luck. And yet what moves along this road tonight will decide, as much as any battle, whether Patton's Third Army reaches the German border or grinds to a halt within sight of it. The Germans had built their war around steel on tracks. The Americans were about to win a decisive stretch of it with steel on wheels, and the story of how that fleet came to exist, and how it very nearly wasn't enough, is one of the quieter triumphs of the entire European campaign. By the late summer of 1944, the Allied breakout from Normandy had turned from a hard-fought struggle into something closer to a rout, and that success had created a problem nobody had fully planned for. German forces were falling back toward their own border in disarray, and American and British commanders sensed, correctly, that a rapid pursuit might end the war in the West before winter. The difficulty was not tanks or men, or even fuel sitting in depots. The difficulty was distance. The Allied armies had landed with an enormous logistical apparatus built to support a slow, methodical advance from the Normandy beaches, and that apparatus assumed supplies would move a short distance from ship to front. By September, the front had raced more than 600 kilometers ahead of the Normandy ports, and every liter of petrol, every crate of ammunition, every ration tin needed to reach frontline divisions had to travel that distance over roads that retreating German engineers had done their best to wreck, and over a rail network so thoroughly destroyed by Allied bombing before the invasion that it would take months to restore. The scale of daily consumption made the shortfall brutal in the plainest arithmetic. A single armored division on the move could burn through in excess of 75,000 liters of fuel in a single day, and Patton's Third Army alone, at the height of its advance, was consuming something in the region of 1.4 million liters daily just to keep moving. Planners had assumed the port of Cherbourg and eventually Brest would be handling this volume by late summer. But Cherbourg had been so comprehensively demolished by its German garrison before surrender that it took weeks longer than expected to bring back into full operation. And Brest, when it finally fell, proved to be virtually useless as a deep-water port for months afterward. That left the beaches and the smaller Normandy harbors doing far more work than anyone had budgeted for, and it left an enormous aching gap between where the supplies physically sat and where the armies desperately needed them to be. Rail transport, the obvious long-term answer, simply did not exist in usable form. Allied bombing campaigns in the run-up to D-Day had deliberately targeted French rail infrastructure to hamper German reinforcement, and they had succeeded so thoroughly that bridges, marshalling yards, and rolling stock across northern France lay in ruins, precisely the infrastructure now needed to move Allied supplies forward. Rebuilding it was underway, but it could not be rebuilt at the speed the front was advancing. Air transport could move urgent items in small quantities, but nothing on the scale of the tonnage an army group required simply to keep its engines turning. What remained, by process of brutal elimination, was the road network, and what the road network required was trucks, in numbers that no army in history had previously assembled, driven around the clock by men who would spend days at a time behind the wheel with barely any rest, and organized into a system that had to be invented and refined even as it was already running at full stretch. It was, on paper, close to an impossible problem. The answer that emerged was not a single brilliant weapon or a stroke of engineering genius, but something far less glamorous and, in its own way, far more remarkable. Sheer, staggering industrial scale, applied to the humble lorry. The vehicle that made it possible had begun rolling off American production lines years before anyone anticipated the crisis it would eventually solve. The GMC CCWK, universally known to the men who drove it as the Jimmy, was a 2.5-ton six-wheel drive lorry designed by General Motors and built in enormous numbers across plants in Michigan, Missouri, and elsewhere, with Chevrolet and Studebaker also producing near-identical or complementary designs to keep pace with demand. It was not a sophisticated machine. Its engine, a straightforward inline six-cylinder producing around 90 horsepower, was chosen deliberately for reliability over performance. Because a truck that broke down on the road to the front was worse than useless, it was an obstruction. The chassis used a dual rear axle configuration, 6 wheels total, which gave it the traction to handle the broken, muddy tracks of rural France that had never been built for military traffic of this weight and volume. Loaded, it could carry roughly 2.5 tons of cargo, though drivers on the most desperate stretches of the supply run routinely overloaded them well beyond that figure, trusting the design's legendary durability to hold together under the strain. What made the CCKW extraordinary was not any single technical feature but the sheer volume in which it was produced. General Motors alone built more than 560,000 examples of the CCKW and its variants over the course of the war, manufactured on assembly lines that had been rapidly converted, expanded, and in some cases built from nothing, specifically to meet military demand once America's industrial base pivoted fully to war production after Pearl Harbor. Alongside it came other workhorses. The Studebaker US-6, built in numbers exceeding 200,000, many of which were shipped to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease and became so numerous in the Red Army that some Soviet soldiers reportedly assumed Studebaker was simply the generic word for lorry. Dodge produced smaller 3/4-ton trucks by the hundreds of thousands for more specialized roles. Taken together, American industry produced somewhere in the region of 2.5 million military trucks of various classes across the war, a figure so large it is genuinely difficult to visualize, roughly equivalent to putting a truck on the road for every family in a mid-sized American city, several times over, and then shipping the entire fleet across an ocean. Getting these vehicles from factory floor to French road was itself a logistical undertaking of staggering complexity. Trucks were shipped disassembled or partially assembled to save cargo space aboard the already stretched Atlantic convoys, then reassembled at depots in Britain before D-Day, tested, and staged for the invasion. Once ashore, they were organized from the end of August 1944 into what became known as the Red Ball Express, a dedicated one-way highway loop running from the Normandy beachhead supply dumps forward to the advancing armies and back again, with military police stationed at intervals to keep traffic flowing and civilian vehicles cleared from the route entirely. At its peak, the Red Ball Express operated something in the order of 6,000 vehicles simultaneously, running continuously, day and night, with drivers frequently pushed to 18 or 20 hours behind the wheel, catching sleep in brief snatches at supply dumps before turning around and driving back the way they had come. The overwhelming majority of the drivers who kept this system running were African American soldiers, serving in a U.S. Army that was still rigidly segregated, assigned disproportionately to transportation and support units rather than combat roles, and it was these men, largely uncredited in the popular memory of the campaign that followed, who physically carried the fuel and ammunition that allowed Patton's tanks to keep moving. The atmosphere on the Red Ball Express, as described in the surviving accounts of the men who drove it, was one of relentless, grinding exhaustion punctuated by genuine danger. Convoys ran with headlights masked to slits to reduce visibility to enemy aircraft, navigating roads pitted with shell craters and lined with the wreckage of German vehicles destroyed during the retreat, and drivers frequently fell asleep at the wheel from sheer fatigue, a hazard that claimed more casualties on some stretches of road than enemy action did. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. German intelligence, to the extent it grasped what was happening on French roads that autumn, appears to have significantly underestimated the scale of American logistical capacity, having built its own military doctrine around a much smaller ratio of supply vehicles to combat units. Documented interrogations of German prisoners taken during the pursuit across France describe genuine astonishment at the density and constancy of American truck traffic, a volume that simply had no equivalent in the German Army's own experience, where fuel shortages and reliance on horse-drawn transport for a large proportion of logistics remained a persistent weakness throughout the war, even for supposedly mechanized formations. The comparison with German logistics is instructive precisely because of how lopsided it was. The Wehrmacht, for all the popular image of the Blitzkrieg as an entirely mechanized force, relied on horses for a substantial proportion of its transport needs throughout the war, with some estimates suggesting the German army employed well over 1 million horses at any given time for hauling artillery and supplies, a figure that sits uncomfortably against the Reich's reputation for industrial modernity. German truck production never approached American figures, hampered by a fragmented manufacturing base spread across dozens of firms producing incompatible models with poor parts interchangeability. A stark contrast to the standardized, mass-produced American approach that allowed a mechanic in Normandy to repair a CCKW with parts stripped from any other CCKW in the depot. British logistics, by comparison, were resourceful and well-organized but operated on a fundamentally smaller industrial base, and British forces came to rely heavily on American-built trucks supplied under Lend-Lease arrangements to fill gaps that domestic production simply could not cover, with vehicles like the Canadian-built Ford and Chevrolet military trucks serving alongside British-designed equivalents across multiple theaters. The material impact of this trucking effort is difficult to reduce to a single tidy figure, but historians broadly agree that without it, the pursuit across France in the late summer of 1944 would have stalled considerably sooner than it did, potentially giving German forces the breathing room to establish a more coherent defensive line before winter. The psychological effect on the retreating German army, confronted with an enemy that appeared able to sustain an advance regardless of how badly the rail network had been wrecked, contributed to a broader sense among German commanders that the material gap between the two sides had become, in practical terms, unbridgeable. Some historians have argued the Red Ball Express and its associated logistical effort ultimately consumed so much fuel, simply moving fuel, that its net efficiency was lower than often claimed, a criticism worth acknowledging honestly rather than glossing over, since the trucks themselves burned a meaningful proportion of what they carried, simply covering the enormous distances involved. What is not seriously disputed is that without this fleet, in whatever imperfect form it took, the advance would have halted far short of where it did. The legacy of this effort extended well beyond the autumn of 1944. The techniques refined under the pressure of the Red Ball Express, standardized vehicle design, dedicated one-way supply routes, centralized traffic control, and above all, the sheer principle that industrial mass production could substitute for logistical finesse, influenced American military transportation doctrine for decades afterward, shaping the enormous vehicle fleets that would later support American forces in Korea and Vietnam. Surviving examples of the GMCC-CWK can still be seen today in military vehicle museums across the United States and Europe, occasionally restored to running condition and driven in commemorative convoys that retrace, in a small way, the routes their wartime counterparts once traveled. The contribution of the predominantly African-American drivers who kept the system running has, in recent decades, received belated and still incomplete recognition, a reminder that the historical record does not always credit fairly the men whose labor made victory possible. Return for a moment to that dust track through the Normandy bocage on the first night of September 1944. The corporal in the lead truck, gripping his wheel through the darkness, could not have known that he was part of an effort historians would later credit with keeping an entire Army group moving at a moment when its own supply lines should, by any reasonable calculation, have already failed. He was not fighting the war so much as feeding it, one overloaded lorry at a time, down roads never built to carry this much weight, at a pace no army had previously attempted to sustain. Germany had built its military identity around the tank, the Panzer Division, the concentrated steel fist breaking through enemy lines. America answered, in the final calculation, not merely with tanks of its own, but with something the German war machine could never truly match: the unglamorous, unstoppable capacity to keep those tanks fed, fueled, and moving forward, mile after mile, for as long as the advance demanded. It was not won with armor or with guns. It was